Good morning, this is Jen, the Liberty Lion. Today I want to talk more about the independent state and the dependent state. This is important to understand because once you understand the dependent state versus the independent state, you have a much better understanding of the roles of government. I believe it's important to understand the difference, not only so you can understand the roles of government, so that you can understand many of the other topics that I speak of, including who has the sovereign authority and where is it that you want to be. Do you want to be in a dependent state or do you want to be in an independent state? And when I say state, I don't necessarily mean your status as far as your quality of life or your status in life, but also your status in government. So I have this map. It's from nationalatlas.gov. It's from a government website that has so-called been expired by the government. Supposedly it was a temporary website. And they may have these maps still online somewhere. And some people have sent me some links to websites where you can dig around and find the maps, but I haven't been able to find maps such as this one for all of the states. But I did have this one for Texas, in which I copied several copies and then downloaded them into my computer. So I have this one. Now, as far as the relationship between the federal government and the states, the independent states go, all the states should basically look the same. So even if you're not in Texas, whatever state you're in should be the same. You just have to figure out, are you on federal lands or are you off federal lands? If you're on federal lands, it's probably because you're in the military. And if you're off federal lands, it's probably because you're not in the military. When I joined the military back in the 90s, what I'm about to tell you was common knowledge. The military people that I served with understood this to be true, what I'm about to tell you, although there are many people in the military who do not understand this. So this is not a new concept. It's nothing new that I'm telling you. It's been around since the Constitution was written. It's been around since the Articles of Confederation was written. And it'd been around for a lot longer than that. So what we have here is a map of Texas. Okay? So the map of Texas before it joined the Union, called the United States, was just simply Texas. Inside Texas, all the people, the settlers and inhabitants who lived in Texas, created a government for themselves. This is talked about in one of the congressional records. And I've done a video on the congressional record that I'm speaking of. So if you want to see that record, you'll have to go over and find one of those videos in my list. If I have time, I'll post it in the description so that you can see it. But it's a congressman in the congressional record, and he asks, what is a state? Is a state something the people of the state create for themselves, or is it something created by the men in Congress? And so I say it is both. And it was a rhetorical question because he knew it was both. The question was to probably spark interest in the minds of people and to confront the other members of Congress on what it was they were doing. I don't recall the year of this congressional record. I believe it was after the Civil War. The Civil War is a very important time on our timeline of events when understanding the states. And the reason why is because the Civil War created a situation where the federal government overtook the free, sovereign, and independent states. Before the Civil War, the states were said to be sovereign over the federal government because the word sovereign is sort of like saying something that is the best or the top or the first. So a sovereign state is an independent state. And we're talking about the states that people create. States are created by people. Without people, there would be no state. So when Texas wanted to join the Union, the settlers and inhabitants first had to create a state for themselves. So they drew out their landmass, which we see here is the outline of Texas. And then they gave their government certain powers. And that government was called Republic of Texas, and it was located in Austin. At the time, there was no Capitol building built in Austin. The Capitol building wasn't built until after Texas joined the Union. The Union, you have to understand, is simply an agency which works for the states. It's not necessarily a country or a nation, the United States. The United States of America is the country, is the nation. But to be something like a nation, you have to be able to protect what is yours, and that's in the Law of Nations. The Law of Nations is mentioned in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8. So in Article 1, Section 8, it talks about the Law of Nations. And the Law of Nations was also a book written by Emmerich de Vattel. Back in the 1700s, was checked out from the Congressional Library by George Washington prior to writing the Constitution. And then later we see the Law of Nations in the Constitution, which was in part written by George Washington. The difficulty in understanding all this doesn't come from the fact that it is difficult. It comes from the fact that people have been led to believe something that's not true. And so we have to make sense of things in such a way that allows people to easily let go of their current beliefs so that they can understand something that they didn't know. And I think it's helpful if people understand something they didn't know and let go of their current belief of something, if it can be explained in such a way that makes it easy for them. So the easier something is to understand, the easier and faster it is for someone to accept and to believe. And belief should be based in fact and not opinion. And so what I hope to do here today is to state the facts. So when Texas wrote its Constitution for Republic of Texas, there was no Capitol building in Austin. What happened was Texas wanted to join, well, Texas actually didn't want to join the Union, but the Union wanted Texas in it because Texas had a large military. And according to the Law of Nations, you don't have anything if you can't protect it. Because if you can't protect what you have, someone will come and take it. This is the entire basis of many shows, the most popular one being The Walking Dead, where you see various, whatever you want to call them, colonies, societies, communities, building themselves and building walls around themselves and teaching people how to fight, are constantly being attacked by other people who either just don't want them to have what they have or want to have what they have. And they have a variety of ways of coming in and taking it, whether it be through deception, whether it be by force, whether it be by agreement, whether it be by an offer, an acceptance, which is a contract, such as we've seen in season 11, where the character from Lance, I think is its name, the character from the quote Commonwealth end quote community comes in and makes an offer so that he can overtake it peacefully with consent. He makes an offer, but they reject his offer, and so he gets mad and he just comes in and takes it over anyway. This is basically what the federal government has done. They've just used a variety of ways to come in and take over the sovereign states and the sovereign people of those states, being the settlers and inhabitants, to make it appear as though the federal government is over everything. Whereas what I told you earlier was that people in the military, or at least when I enlisted, know that the federal government is not in charge of the entire country. It doesn't make laws for the entire country. It only makes laws for those lands which are annexed. So when Texas agreed to join the Union, it had to take a vote. It had to ask the people, because that's the way a true republic is ran. The problem with the vote is that most people didn't vote. Many people who did vote voted yes, but instead of accounting the entire population of Texas and saying, well, the majority of people didn't vote, therefore their vote is cast to the negative, instead, they took a tally of only those who did vote. And then whatever the majority was out of those who did vote was the winning vote, which was for annexation. And there are still many problems with that. So the people of Texas have to agree. They have to agree to annexation. Now, annexation did not mean that the entire area of Texas, being all the territory of Texas, does not mean that it was all given over to the federal government. A lot of people want to argue with this, but it is written in the laws, in the Constitution, in the agreement between Texas and the federal government, and in officers' manuals, and in Eisenhower's reports. It is written over and over and over again that certain processes had to take place. Those processes were annexation, a vote, an agreement to what lands would be annexed, an agreement to what powers over those lands would be ceded to the federal government. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that Texas remained free, sovereign, and independent. It remained an independent state, and according to the founders, Texas was to continue its sovereignty under the Republic of Texas, the government of the common people of Texas, the settlers and the inhabitants, because those are the people that the congressman in the congressional record was talking about. The people of the state created a government for themselves. Those are the common people, the people who create the state. They create their own government. They are free, sovereign, and independent. So they had to vote and agree for annexation, which was to give up some small pieces of lands to the federal government for, according to the Constitution, to build forts. Forts according to the law of nations, so that Texas and all the other states that agreed to join the Union would be protected from attack from foreign nations or even within itself, only to protect us. And that protection consisted of very few things that the federal government would do off federal lands, and very few things that the federal government would do on federal lands. The things that they would do off federal lands was basically treaties, declaring war, declaring peace, and helping the states out when there was some sort of uprising. So Texas is now free, sovereign, and independent, always was, and unless the people, being the settlers and inhabitants, or what's commonly known as the common people or the people at large of Texas, agrees to something else. And you have to be careful with those agreements, because those agreements should include a vote from every single person of the state, including every member, unless they don't vote. And if they don't vote, a vote should be counted as the negative. A vote counted as a negative is a vote against. And that's really the way a proper vote should work. So Texas remains free, sovereign, and independent, but the lands ceded to the federal government, all the lands, which was really the blue areas here, up here in the key, the blue areas, Department of Defense. And that's misspelled. It should be defense with an S, because the states did not cede any lands to the federal government, to fight foreign wars. That doesn't even make sense. How would you cede lands within a state to fight for foreign wars, to fight foreign armies in other countries? Or for vengeance, because defense is a Latin word that means vengeance. And defense with an S is not found in the Law of Nations and is not found in any dictionary that I have of the time when the Constitution was written, or before, or directly after. It's not until after the Civil War that the word defense with an S occurs. In the Constitution, it's spelled with a C. I've gone over this in many of my other videos. So if you want to know more about defense with a C or defense with an S, you can look to those videos. So even though Texas ceded some lands to the seat of government, being Washington, D.C., it did not give its entire sovereignty up to the federal government. It only gave up sovereignty over those lands, the people on those lands, and certain other things in the Constitution, such as allowing the seat of government to make treaties, declare war, and declare peace. So these areas for defense inside of Texas make up a new state. And people may say, well, that's a state within a state. Not quite. Because the defense areas, which are the dependent state called State of Texas under the federal government, was the state that Texas, the Republic of Texas, agreed to have the creation of. Agreed to that new state, but no more states within. So no states within those areas, which would make Fort Hood, if it allowed for another state within it, would make Fort Hood an independent state inside an independent state. So then you would have a dependent state inside an independent state called Fort Hood inside another independent state, and you cannot have an independent state inside an independent state. It doesn't work that way. So Texas, even though it's an independent state, is dependent only for the purposes in the Constitution, such as treaties, declaring war, and declaring peace. For all other purposes, it is an independent state. Fort Hood, Fort Bliss, Camp Bullis, I guess, Randolph Air Force Base, Fort Sam Houston, Brooks Air Force Base, Lackland Air Force Base, Laughlin Air Force Base, Corpus Christi Naval Air Station, Kingsville Naval Air Station, I think there's one somewhere around here. These are the areas properly ceded, okay, here's Camp Swift, to the federal government. Cession is a very formal process. Cession requires the government in Texas, the Republic of Texas, to pass laws stating which lands, Fort Bliss, Fort Hood, and all these other forts, exactly surveyed out and everything, would be ceded to the federal government, and what the federal government would be allowed to do on those posts. So if the Republic of Texas lost all its sovereignty when it joined the Union, first of all, it doesn't make sense. And second of all, why would they need Texas to cede the specific lands to the federal government, as well as specific cession of the right to make laws for those areas? And Texas did not cede all right to make laws over those federal areas. They only ceded some rights. And it retained the right to secede from the Union. So Fort Bliss cannot secede from the Union. Fort Hood cannot secede from the Union. Camp Swift, I'm assuming that's a military area, cannot secede from the Union. No military area, no federal post can secede from the Union because they are dependent states. They are part of the federal government. They cannot secede from the Union and become independent states and become a state within a state, or an independent state within an independent state. This is the problem I have with the Constitution, is it doesn't properly say which states are dependent and which states are independent, which allows for, in time, the Constitution to be misunderstood, which it has been, which makes someone maybe wonder if that wasn't the intention all along, to someday allow the federal government to overtake the independent states. I don't know. But that is what Lincoln did. So these federal areas cannot secede from the Union because they are not independent states. Texas and all of its people, without the federal areas, being free, sovereign, and independent, can secede from the Union because they are independent. They are free, sovereign, and independent. They retained their sovereignty. They didn't necessarily maintain their sovereignty, but they retained their sovereignty. So in order for Texas to cede from the Union, it has to kick out the federal people. It has to tell all the federal people to leave. And it can do that by passing a law stating that no federal people or no federal works will any longer be allowed to take place inside of Texas. I'm not saying they should, and I'm not saying they should not. Many people have a hard time believing that Texas is still free, sovereign, and independent, and has authority for most purposes over the federal government. They believe that Texas is, for all purposes, under the federal government. But this idea was perpetuated by people such as John D. Rockefeller, Abraham Lincoln, the railroads, and other progressives who have been trying to do this for a long time, even before Lincoln came into office. Lincoln was simply the one who finally achieved it. There are two in-your-face facts that can't be denied that show that Texas, for all purposes outside the Constitution, are sovereign, meaning over, above the federal government. And those are, first, the cession laws, meaning the republic, after it annexed itself or its lands to the federal government, then had to cede jurisdiction over the federal areas, but is also in the Texas Jurisprudence Manual, 3rd edition, found in law libraries in the courthouses in Texas, where it states that the Republic of Texas only ceded sovereignty that is in the Constitution to the federal government, which is basically the right to make laws for the federal lands, not to interfere in the military functions on the federal lands, not to make treaties, and not to declare war or peace for the entire country. But also, the Capitol was built after Texas joined the Union. And the Capitol building on the rotunda floor says Republic of Texas. It does not say State of Texas, because Texas did not become, at annexation, State of Texas. It retained its sovereignty, and so it continued being, for all areas not on the federal lands, it continued being Republic of Texas. So these federal areas are the dependent areas. They're dependent on the existence of the federal government, and they're dependent on the federal government for all their money. Republic of Texas is dependent to the people, because the people pay the people in the public capacity, working as state employees. So the governor requires getting paid by the people of Texas, not the federal government. So the Republic of Texas is dependent on the people. State of Texas is dependent on the federal government, and the federal government is dependent on the Republic of Texas. So it's as if there's a line of authority, as people say. First, in this country, you have the people. And then you have their state. The states then have the federal government, and the federal government has forts inside the states. And each one is to some extent dependent on the other. The people depend on their state government, Republic of Texas, to keep them safe. The Republic of Texas is dependent on the federal government to keep the nation safe. The nation is dependent on the federal government and all the states collectively to keep the nation safe, and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of clarifying who has sovereignty and who does not, Republic of Texas has sovereignty over the federal government for all purposes not listed in the Constitution. And the federal areas are dependent on the federal government. And the federal areas cannot secede from the Union because they have no sovereignty. The Republic of Texas can secede from the Union because it is an independent state, and it can do so by simply passing legislation requiring that all federal people in their federal capacities leave the state. Now, that does not mean that they can't retain their homes off federal lands or any land they have off federal lands. It just means that the authority they have under the federal government goes away. So many people have done business with the state of Texas, being the dependent state, in order to keep them safe, but that's not exactly how it's supposed to work. And what those people did when they wrote their papers and sent them to the federal government, being the state of Texas, was they contracted personally with a system outside the federal government. I call them the middlemen. They've been called by many names. Shadow government, instrumentalities, either appropriated or non-appropriated, mafia government, military-industrial complex, the deep state, abstract states, non-positive states, unconstitutional states or unconstitutional government. I call them middlemen because most people are familiar with business terms. And this is all about business, and it's all about contracts, and it's all about money. So what you did when you agreed to get a loan for a home, or file papers with the state of Texas, or go into the state of Texas courts and battle it out with someone else, is you agreed to allow a state, a dependent state, resolve matters for you, protect you, etc., which was really a business transaction with a middleman. Because the federal government cannot, in its federal capacity, do all those things because the Constitution does not allow it. The Constitution does not allow the federal government to take over private property. So what they did to make it appear as though they could is they created a middleman. Something that looks like it's a government but isn't. It's outside the government, and that's why many of the titles that they operate under have never been passed into law. They cannot be passed into law because they're not part of the federal government as far as within the confines of the Constitution. They have no authority. They have no power. For example, the Federal Reserve in Texas, they're located on lands not properly purchased according to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution. They're not properly purchased according to the Constitution. And so there is no power for Congress to regulate them except by their charters. So the Federal Reserve is a private business located off federal lands, meaning it has no authority and it's outside the Constitution, operating under such titles as Title 12 Banks and Banking, which has never been passed into law, not for defense purposes, acting as a middleman to siphon money off of people who are supposed to be free, sovereign, and independent settlers and inhabitants of the Republic of Texas. So it's been a way for the federal government to institute a corporation called an instrumentality, which appears by deception, fraud, deceit, absolute lies, appears to be a federal entity, which it is actually not. Appearing to have authority which it does not have. Lying to you and trying to get you to sign federal forms which you do not have to sign. And they do it using the IRS. The IRS, Internal Revenue Service, under Title 26, is private contracts with the free, sovereign, and independent settlers and inhabitants of the Republic of Texas and other states. But the ones that work on the federal lands come under Title 5. So they pay taxes. The federal people, the federal employees and federal military people called armed forces on the federal lands pay taxes according to Title 5 and Title 10. Everyone else pays the IRS taxes according to Title 26. Title 5 has been passed into law, and Title 10. Title 5 is government, organization, and employees, is passed into law because it is constitutional. Title 10, armed forces, is passed into positive law, meaning it's according to the Constitution. Title 26 is not passed into positive law because it is not part of the Constitution. Siphoning money off of private people outside the federal lands within the Republic of Texas, the settlers and inhabitants, the free, sovereign, and independent people. Title 26 has no authority over them and has never been passed into positive law because it is not in accordance with the Constitution. It is simply a contract. It's a contract with individuals off federal lands so that they can extract money as a middleman from the free people into the IRS acting under Title 26 to give to the IRS acting under Title 5 and Title 10 to then give to the federal government, which continues to enlarge the federal government. And then the federal government then gives that money out to other unconstitutional associations, organizations. They give it in the way of grants. They give it back to the states for education, small jurisdictions, small businesses, etc., and so forth. So in the titles where it talks about small businesses and small jurisdictions, it's not speaking solely of the free, sovereign, and independent people who create businesses for themselves, but small jurisdictions or small businesses such as school districts, which are under federal control, which originally were under the free, sovereign, and independent people of the Republic of Texas, the settlers and inhabitants who built schools for themselves. So a long time ago, there's case law written where the federal people wanted to come off the federal lands and use the schools of the free, sovereign, and independent people, which the free, sovereign, and independent people paid for. And the federal people wanted to use those schools, and they were told no because they were not state taxpayers. Lincoln changed all that. The progressives changed all that. They didn't change it in reality. They only changed it in your mind, and they got you to act a certain way. They got all of us for a long time now to act a certain way, which was to believe that you were part of the federal government and that you were under the federal government and you had to abide by the federal government's laws. when in reality you do not, because you are in the independent state, the Republic of Texas, or your original state of New Mexico, or the original state of Oklahoma, or the original state of Arkansas, Louisiana, so on and so forth, under your original governments that those people formed for themselves. So they were told no, and they had no schools on the federal lands. So I guess they got upset about that, and was one reason why they wanted to take over the states. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The problem is that the federal government never had absolute power. It's the people of the states who have absolute power. We have the absolute power, the common people. The problem is nowadays is that you can't convince some people of the truth. It's like once some lie or something has taken place in their minds, they're unable to shake it. They're unable to let it go. But I'm hoping that the more people understand this, the more they can let go of what's false and accept what's true. So in short, the original states are created by the people of the state, the free, sovereign, and independent people of the state. And they have original jurisdiction, they have ultimate jurisdiction, they have sovereign jurisdiction. The dependent states are the states created by the federal government under the control of the federal government on the federal lands within the state to which the independent state agreed to let them have. Once you understand the independent and dependent situation of states, all of this will sort of be like dominoes falling into place. Everything will just start to fall into place once you start thinking about it. But you have to understand that the federal government, for most purposes, have no power. They are subjects of the independent states. It's an agency providing a service of defense to the independent states. And I take you to two places, actually three places in the Constitution that tells you this. First, the Preamble. In my own words, says the representatives of the federal government work to do all these things for the independent states. So we, the people, being the representatives of the United States, being the federal government, do the things listed: general welfare, tranquility, blessings of liberty, mutual defense, and justice, for the United States of America, being the independent states. It says in Article 1, Section 8, the Congress makes the laws, and it has a list of laws. Article 1, Section 8 is one long sentence. It can't be taken apart. It has to stay together. It says basically, we do these things on the federal lands. And the federal lands are purchased in the states and the seat of government. And on these federal lands, we do this list of things, including erection of buildings for mutual defense. All you have to do is read Article 1, Section 8. And in Article 1, Section 1, it says Congress shall make the law for the United States. The United States are all the federal lands. And all the federal lands are those places purchased and the seat of government. The places purchased by the consent of the states, the independent states. So the third place is in Article 2, under the powers of the president. The president has two positions: executive in a military capacity, meaning second in command. That's why he has a house at the seat. Nobody else has a house at the seat. because he's second in command to the independent states, and he's first in command over the dependent states, the federal areas, the people on the federal areas. Because the seat of government is a military post, and he is the commander-in-chief over the seat of government and all the federal areas inside the states. It's his job to make sure that these things are done properly according to the Constitution, and when he doesn't, he's acting outside the Constitution, and acts outside the Constitution are void, as if they never existed. You don't have to go to court to get them voided. They are void, as if they never existed. You can act like they don't exist. It's the middlemen we have a problem with. The middlemen located off the federal lands, such as the federal banks and the IRS acting under Title 26. So the Constitution tells you the federal government is not supreme or sovereign over you. In many places, where it says these are the laws of the lands, it's talking about specifically the federal lands, or directly over the federal lands, and indirectly over the sovereign states as second in command. Each military commander over a military post has a home. Most of the officers do, and the enlisted. But each of these officers have a home on the federal post because they're supposed to stay there. They're not supposed to come off the federal lands, and if they do, they leave their executive officer in charge. The commander only has power over the post that he is assigned to. He not only has an oath, but he has a commission. If he wants to keep his commission, he must act according to his oath. Anyone coming off the federal lands claiming to have authority has none. Even if they have an oath, if they have a commission, or if they don't have a commission, they have no authority. And they have no authority off federal lands anyway. Which is why they had to create the middlemen. Because the middlemen are not part of the Constitution. They're just there to siphon money off of you. They're there as thieves. They're there as the mafia, as the shadow government, as the military-industrial complex, as businessmen, giving money back to the colleges to help perpetuate the idea that the federal government is all powerful over all people and over all states, which is a lie. Most of the things they say are lies. In Chambers' etymological dictionary, it shows that statehood was first used in 1868. And I believe that's because during this administration, what they were trying to do was get all power over the independent states. Take power over the independent states. But, like I said, the military know that they have no power off federal lands. It's these powerless middlemen who are siphoning money off of us, who are chartered with the federal government as an instrumentality, either appropriated or non-appropriated, to take money from us to enlarge the federal state, the dependent states, to make them big because they want to be independent, because power corrupts. Power always corrupts. So this is why you need to get ready, buy your gold and silver, get your yard animals, your chickens and your rabbits and your garden going, and get your gold and silver and get ready, because at some point in time, the federal government is going to have to contract, as in become smaller. As it becomes smaller, there may be rough times ahead, But I believe shortly after that, there will be a explosion in small businesses, and the idea of independence and local commerce and farmers markets and all these things will expand, and they'll be larger in number, and we can prepare for that ahead of time if we know what's to come. And I believe this is what is to come, because once people realize that the two faces of the federal government, and one face has no power and the other face has very little power, it will have no choice but to contract, because ideas have a tendency to grow very quickly if it is for the betterment of people. And I believe this one is. So like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, information, please consider posting them in the comments section, and I'll answer questions if I can. If I cannot, I'll point you into a direction where you may be able to find an answer. And for now, be free, be sovereign, be independent, and get your house in order. I'll see you in the next video.